Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes on building unbreakable trust in teams. Tim Baker's my name. Look forward to working with you this morning and talking about a very interesting and obviously popular topic. So trust is obviously very elusive. Trust can ebb and flow depending on the circumstances you're in. Or trust, of course, can vary depending on who it is you're working with in your team. So it's a very complex topic. But of course, we all know trust when we see it, and we all know trust when we don't, when we see it as well, distrust. So we know what it looks like, but of course, it's a very complex topic. So I'll share my screen and we'll launch into the topic, and away we go. If you've got any questions you'd like to ask, then you're more than welcome, of course, to put them into the chat box, and I will respond to them as soon as I see them. So look, those of you that don't know me, I know there are many of you that tune in regularly to these Friday sessions, but I'm an author. I've written 11 books, and obviously one of those books is Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. I am a keynote speaker. I'm an executive coach. I also run workshops for leaders in a variety of different topics, many of those virtually these days, as you can imagine. And I also play in the Golden Oldies rugby competition in Brisbane, and we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks at my age to recover. So, but of course, it's all a lot of fun. All right, so let's launch into what we're talking about today. Now, the book Winning Teams has received a lot of wonderful endorsements from people in the sporting world and also senior leaders as well. And it's great to have plenty of, I do talk a lot about the All Blacks in the book, and Grant Fox, the legendary All Black player, wrote a lovely testimonial for me. And also Nick Farr-Jones, the World Cup winning captain of the Australian Wallabies. So there was a lot of really nice testimonials about the book, which is always nice to have. And I guess what I'm probably saying there is there are a lot of parallels in the sporting world that we could look at in the business world. And ultimately, that's why I did draw on the All Blacks. The All Blacks have an 83% success rate, which is phenomenal. And I believe they're the most successful sporting team in the world. So I do draw on inspiration from them and talk a lot about that. Okay, now in my book, there is 8, as of course the subtitle is the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And you can see on the right-hand side, the model of the 8 characteristics are around the outside of the model. And you can see that I've got an arrow pointed at building trust. That's one of 8 characteristics. And if you pressed me and said, well, what do you think would be the key characteristics? I would have to say that one of them was building trust, because it would be very hard to develop a high-performing team where there was a low level of trust. In fact, I think it's almost impossible to do that. But the elusive thing about trust is that in a team, there's not just your trust with each individual team member, and that could change and vary depending on your relationship. But it also is the trust between the team members with each other. And then you've got another layer of complexity, and that is your team's individual and collective trust with various stakeholders in the organization and beyond. So that's why it becomes a very elusive topic and an interesting topic. So the only thing that you can control, in my view, is your working relationship with each team member. And if you can build that to a reasonable level of trust, and remember, it's not all your responsibility, because some of your team members may be less trusting than you would like them to be. But if you can do that, nevertheless, you will create a good culture in your team. And of course, you'll dissipate some of the mistrust that goes on between team members and stakeholders, and perhaps with each other. So it is something that is partially in your control. And obviously today I want to talk about that. Now, one of the objections, of course, that people have about this topic is, doesn't Doesn't trust ebb and flow? Well, yes, it does. And in a team, I don't have much control over trust levels. You might be surprised that you have more control over it than you probably think, although you don't have complete control over it, because whenever there's two people in any working relationship, or any relationship at all for that matter, it takes two to tango. In other words, it's not just about you trusting other people have got to trust you as well. So it's not something completely in your control, but it's certainly, you have more influence in that area than you probably think. And I think that's my key point there. So the question then, of course, is what can you do about all of that? So I want to cover three things today in our short session. We've only got 30 minutes together, but I want to talk about the fundamental elements of trust that comes from research. So if we were looking at a trusting relationship between two people, what are the 5 elements that underpin trust? So let's have a look at that for starters. And I think the important thing for you is then to think, well, how many of these do I exhibit? Or where, more importantly, could I improve in my levels of trust with my team members? I want to talk about a team values charter. Is a wonderful vehicle that I talk about in detail in my book as a way of building and galvanizing trust in your team. So I'll leave you something very practical there that you can take away with you. And at the end, I'll give you a special offer later on in the presentation. So in my book, which I co-wrote with Aubrey Warren, one of my other books, Conversations at Work, we talked about 5 elements of trust. And the argument is that these 5 elements make up the trust equation, if you like. And if any of these are missing, or perhaps not quite to the extent that they should be, then it's likely that trust will be perhaps not what it should be. So we've got openness, acceptance, congruence, reliability, and competence. So I will talk about each of those in some detail and explain what they mean. And while I do that, I suggest that you have a think about your own relationships in your team and how you might be able to exhibit more of each of these 5 elements. And that way, of course, you have a little bit more control over trust in your team. As we said earlier, trust will ebb and flow. So there are circumstances beyond your control that can impact on trust. So, for example, if the company's promised something and hasn't delivered, then of course there's going to be a violation of trust, and you're going to be not necessarily blamed for that, but you'll certainly feel the impact of that. So let's look at each, and we'll start with openness. Now, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it is true to say that an appropriate level of openness in conversations gives others a sense of your self-confidence and willingness to connect with them. Now, the problem with openness, of course, is twofold. One is when you're open with people, what it does is it leaves you vulnerable. So, for example, if you shared a point of view about something that was controversial, whilst you're being open, it may be rejected by other people. So sometimes you might think to yourself, well, I'll keep that to myself. That's one problem. Now, the other problem, of course, is how open can you be? Introverts will tend to be less open than extroverts in a general sense. And of course, you can be too open in a relationship. So finding the line between what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of sharing your own view of the world is a judgment call that you have to make, and it's very much dependent on your own personality. But I would say this to you, that being a closed book or playing your cards close to your chest means it's obviously going to be hard for other people to really get to know who you are. So disclosing a little bit about yourself is important. But as I say, it's a subjective judgment about how far you go with that. But people who are often trusting are people who are willing to disclose and share their own opinions and points of view in corridor conversations with people. And that becomes extremely important. So there has to be some degree of that. And if you're a very private person, then obviously that's hard work. You might find, of course, conversely, that one of your team members is a very private person, plays their cards close to their chest, and it can be quite frustrating for you to break through. But the first step is to be open. So what that actually means is if you make a mistake, it's a good idea to own up to that and to apologize for it, because that shows a degree of transparency and openness. And of course, if you don't know the answer to something, you're not expected to know the answer to everything, then just admit that you don't know. So this adds a layer of authenticity, of course, to your working relationships with other people. So that's obviously one characteristic. Now, another characteristic is acceptance. Now, this is the flip side of the openness coin. So whilst on the one hand, we're saying you should be open with people, you should also be as reasonably accepting as you possibly can of other people's points of view. So what that means, of course, is not necessarily judging people's points of view, or in fact, even agreeing with their point of view, but being open to their point of view is what acceptance really is about. So when people share information about themselves, don't forget they're choosing to take a risk as well. And when they're doing that, it's obviously a little vulnerable for them to do that. And your response to that will very much depend on whether or not you're ticking this box of acceptance. So, for example, if someone says something that maybe you don't necessarily agree with, instead of saying straight out, I disagree with you, which closes down their point of view, probably a better option would be to ask them to explain that point of view a little more for you so that you understand where they're coming from, and just being tolerant and accepting of a different point of view. Remember, of course, you can always agree to disagree with someone. And I think this is a very powerful approach, to say to somebody, look, you've got a point of view, I've got a point of view, let's just agree to disagree and move on. That can be still accepting, although it doesn't mean that you necessarily have adopted their point of view. We know that there's a chance of rejection or judgment when we divulge something personal about ourselves, and that's why people play their cards close to their chest. And so if you as a leader are not accepting of other people and their own perspectives, then what you're doing is you're encouraging them to be less open. And because of course they see it as a risk, and they decide not to share with you additional information as such. So you can see that that can be problematic. So openness and acceptance is all about, one, you being open, and two, you being accepting of other people's points of view. So those two things are very important. And as I said before, you don't have to agree with someone. Acceptance can be that you just accept that someone has a point of view that's different to yours. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accept that that's right. Now, a third one, and I think this is probably one that's hugely underestimated in the workforce, is what we call congruence. Now, what congruence really means is that what you say and what you do are aligned. So in other words, you practice what you preach is one cliche. You walk the talk, that's another cliche. But ultimately, if you promise something and you don't deliver on something, that would be incongruent. So in other words, that will violate trust, because your word then becomes cheap, because people can see that you're not following through on that. So it's very much about alignment. And what that basically means for you is that you don't promise something unless you can deliver on it. And that sounds very easy talking to you here now, but of course, when you're bailed up on a conference call, or if you're still working in an office, you're bailed up in the corridor and somebody asks you a question and you're going off to a meeting, it might seem like a simple thing for you just to agree to get them off your back, and then find out later that you can't actually follow through on that well, that would be violating congruence. So what I would suggest in those circumstances is you say to people, leave it with me. I need to think about this a bit further, and I'll come back to you at another stage. And of course, make sure you do. So the other thing is, do we talk straight, or do we couch our opinions and contributions in qualifications and hesitant phrases? Congruence also means being straight with people. It means to be clear. Now, you can be too straight with people. Some people who I coach often say, oh, well, look, I'm just a straight shooter. But I often respond by saying, yes, but you don't have to shoot someone. So, you can be straight about your point of view, which is, of course, partly about being open. But you've also got to be a little bit sensitive and aware of the other person and their own point of view, which may be different from yours. So it's a bit of an art form, of course, to be clear and straight with people without, of course, violating their space as such. What all that means, of course, is there's got to be a balance between bluntness and avoidance. So both of those are not good. I mean, if you're too blunt, people get defensive, don't they? And of course, if you aren't willing to volunteer a point of view or give your opinion about something, you're being seen as avoiding the issue, and that in itself is not helpful for anybody, and that will not help with the trust. So striking the balance, it's a bit like openness. It's something that you have to work out for yourself. But of course, when people walk away from you in a conversation, they need to know where they stand. I think that might be a way of me putting it. So congruence is very, very important. And people, there is another cliche I'd share with you, I think is very, very relevant. People will do what you do rather than what you say, right? So your actions are far more powerful than what you say. So talk is cheap. If you say something and do something, people will take notice of what you do. So what that means is that you've got to be very aware of what you're promising, because, a quick sugar hit by pleasing people, it's fine, but of course you may pay a significant price later when you're not following through on that. Okay, now the next one is reliability, and it's sort of aligned with congruence, because reliability is a familiar element of trust. It sends a message that you'll do what you say you will do. So you follow through. So if you make a promise to somebody, or you're having a conversation with someone and you make a suggestion and this is what you're going to do, then if you don't follow through on that, then obviously in the eyes of the other person, your trust goes down, because next time you promise something, maybe people won't actually bother to believe you. And once you get to that stage, of course, trust is in a downward slide. So the key question for you is if you overpromise and underdeliver, then you're going to be in strife. And this is particularly relevant, and we know when we're working with clients and customers, the old cliche of underpromise and overdeliver, I think, is very relevant. It's relevant as well for you working with your team members. So get into the habit of underpromising and over-delivering rather than the other way around. And of course, if you procrastinate, if you've left, if somebody's come to you and they want a decision on something and you haven't delivered on that decision, then of course people will get very agitated, particularly if it's important to them personally. So what it means is that in those cases where you perhaps have delayed something or made a decision, the best thing you can do is go back to the person and explain the circumstances and why you can't make a decision on that immediately. So of course it does, and that of course allays any suspicion the other person might have where you are just sitting on it and not bothering to do anything about it. So being reliable is critically important, and in fact, it's one of the key characteristics of creating a psychologically safe workplace. So that's very important. It's particularly important in the remote environments that we're working in now, because people can't necessarily pick up your non-verbal cues. There's less direct contact that people have with you. So it's even more important that you're reliable and you follow through on those things. And if you pleasantly surprise people by over delivering, then trust goes up, and that's significant. Okay, so reliability is critically important as well. Okay, and the final one here is competence, and it's often sometimes overlooked. But at the end of the day, we all learn to trust ourselves and others in some situations, but not others. Now, I wouldn't go to a lawyer for advice on interpersonal issues. All right, I'd go to them for legal reasons, and I would trust them because of their competence in that area. Likewise, I probably wouldn't go to a social worker to find out about investment advice, right? So we will trust people in certain situations. And, you know, this is something that if you're competent in an area, say, for example, if you're a good engineer or whatever, yes, that's wonderful because people will trust your competence in that area, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll trust your judgment in other areas. So what that means, of course, is we've constantly got to build our competence base so that people can feel that that we can rely on them. So those are the 5 characteristics. I wonder how you fared in those. I'll just stop sharing for a moment before I move on to the last part of my presentation. So I think, if you keep those 5 balls in the air, you're putting yourself into a position where you will be able to maintain a high level of trust with your team members. Now, we'll drop the ball occasionally. That's just the way it is. That's okay. There is always some tolerance and leeway in these things. But of course, if you're constantly violating any of those 5 elements, then what it's leading to is a mistrusting environment rather than a trusting environment. So what I'd like to do now is just share with you an approach that I think is very powerful and very useful. And it's called a team values charter. And I just want to share with you because in a 20-minute session with your team, this can be extremely powerful. And this comes from my book, The New Influencing Toolkit. And it takes literally 20 minutes to do. And this is how it works. What you do is when you next have a team meeting, and that might be online or it might be face-to-face, depending on where you work and all the rest of it, you ask people these 4 questions. And what I suggest you do is you actually ask people to write the answers down, because basically you want people to be able to think carefully about these questions. So the very first question that you ask, and you get people to write it down on a piece of paper or put it into an iPad or whatever they're using. What's one value that's important to you when working with groups and teams? Now, if you ask me that question, I might say respect. That's just my opinion. But for other people, it might be different things. So you get them to write down one value. So give them a chance to write it down. And then the second question that you ask is, what is your definition of that value? And the reason you're asking that question, of course, is that you want people to be able to articulate what it means. Now, respect, of course, means different things to different people. So if I wrote down an answer to that and we were sitting around and having conversation about this, I might write down, respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they may not agree with their point of view. So that's me, but other people might see respect differently. So I've written that down. I've now got a definition. I've now got one value. And then I will ask another question as a team leader. Why is that value important to you? Now, this gives you enormous insight, of course, into what makes people tick. So it's always a very powerful question. So if you ask me that, I might say, well, I like to feel that I'm respected and my opinions are valued when I'm working with others. That's my opinion. Others might have a different opinion. So I write that down, and you can see that this should only take 20 minutes. It'll take you about 10 minutes to go through the 4 questions and probably about 10 minutes to go around the group, depending on the size, to hear people's responses. And then question 4, and this is where the rubber meets the road. what behaviors would be consistent with that value? So I might write down, for example, not interrupting someone when they speak. To me, that would be a sign of respect. So I write that down, and then when everybody's written down their answers, you actually go around the room and ask people to share with you what the answers are to those 4 questions. You start with yourself because you want to set the tone, and of course you would have done this prior to the workshop or the meeting, and you go through your list and you explain each as you've written it down, and then what you do is you go around the room. Now you'll find, because I've done this with hundreds of organizations and teams in different industries, you will find that people will really embrace this. You'll be very, very pleasantly surprised. And you'll hear a pin drop because people will be listening intently to their colleagues and what they've got to say about these 4 questions. So we go around the group, everybody shares. I encourage people to ask questions for clarification. That's fine. And when we've heard everybody's response, I ask somebody to record the answers to question 1 and 2. We don't need the questions 3 and 4 in the charter. So what I'm actually aiming to do is to find a value that everybody can believe in and want in that team, and a definition of that value. And then what I do at the end of the meeting is I create what we call a team values charter. And that will list all of the values. So for example, if I have 6 members in my team, I might end up with 6 values and 6 definitions. But it's quite possible that 2 of the people in the team have got the same value. That's not a problem. In fact, that's quite a good thing. I will ask those 2 people to get together at the end of the meeting and to look at their 2 definitions and to try to merge both definitions into one statement that they're both happy with. So ultimately, everyone's got skin in the game. And then once I've got this charter, the next step is that I'm going to hold my team accountable for those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold each team member accountable for those values. So it gives us something like a framework to work from, where I can then sort of look at behaviors through the prism of those values. In fact, I might even ask people when they've done something in the workplace, whether or not they felt that they had actually adhered to or honored the team values charter. And it's a great way of holding your team accountable. When you know it really works is when each of your team members is holding each other accountable for the charter. Then you know it's really working well. So I would strongly urge you to give that a go, because I know from experience it works brilliantly. So, of course, I'll be sending you a copy of these slides. I'll also be sending you a copy of the recording as well. So you'll get a chance to go through that again. And of course, if you want more detail, you can purchase my book. So as I said at the outset of today's session, every Friday around this time, I have a short, sharp 30-minute presentation on something practical from one of my books. And next week, next Friday, that's the 10th of September, I have another one called The 3 Key Elements of Productive Working Relationships in Teams, based on research. And that will be at 10 o'clock next week, next Friday, exactly a week away. And you can see at the bottom, the link is there. So I'll be sending you the slides, and you're more than welcome to join any of these sessions. In fact, I'd encourage you to do so. And it's free. And as I say, it's short and sharp and gets straight to the point. The other thing I'd like to say before I finish up is a quick plug for my book. If you'd like a copy of Winning Teams at a reduced cost on Amazon, if you take into account postage, it'll cost you about $35 the last time I looked, if you wanted to purchase the book through Amazon. However, if you want to purchase the book directly from me, I will give you a discount of $25, which is inclusive of postage. And to take advantage of that, all you have to do is send me an email by the close of business today. So there's my email address. If you send me an email and just say, Tim, I'd like a copy of your book, please, at the discount rate, then I will sign the copy for you personally and get it out to you at a reduced rate. So that gives you something to work with, no doubt. All right. So folks, I'll stop sharing. Okay. So folks, that's it from me. I hope you found that useful today, and I hope that I can see more of you and bring your colleagues along as well for these Friday sessions, because I enjoy running them. It's my way of giving back, and hopefully you get something useful out of it as well. So we'll catch up. And just before we go, I'd just like to wish you a very relaxing weekend, if you like. And I know we're all under pressure at this stage in our lives, but I think trying to maintain a positive attitude is a very important part of being a leader. So thank you, everyone. All the best, and keep your eyes peeled for the email, which will have a copy of the slides and the recording. Thanks, everyone, and all the best. Goodbye.